Hey everyone, have you ever stopped to think about how a simple family name, something you're just born with, right? Something you have absolutely zero control over, can actually carry the invisible weight of centuries old social classes? It's kind of wild. Well, in today's Explainer, we're exploring the historical roots of surname based discrimination in Korea and looking at how modern society can finally just move past it. We're going to break down how these historical stigmas were created in the first place, how a literal modern educational miracle completely upended them, and how we can psychologically free ourselves from the shadows of the past. So let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this with a really fundamental question. Are family stigmas actually passed down? I mean, it's a massive paradox, isn't it? In a modern, hyper-advanced democracy, people can somehow still feel emotionally governed by the defunct, super-rigid class laws of the past. The source material highlights this lingering issue, the fact that these ancient societal structures, even though they've been legally abolished for a long time, still cast this incredibly long psychological shadow over certain families today. Why do some folks still carry a sense of shrinking confidence or even trauma just because of their family's historical roots? Well, to figure that out, we have to look directly at the specific markers of this prejudice. So consider these 7 specific syllables: chun, bang, ji, chuk, ma, gol, and pi. In Korean history, there's been this long-standing informal prejudice that basically associated these specific surnames with the lower class. And this is really the elephant in the room that our source addresses head-on. For literally generations, individuals bearing these names have sometimes felt a societal sting, this lingering assumption about their bloodline that traces back hundreds of years. But here's the thing. To dismantle a prejudice, you really have to understand its mechanics. Where did the stigma attached to these specific names actually come from? To find the root of this trauma, we have to shift our focus way back in time. The source points us directly to the Joseon era. Now, it's absolutely crucial to understand that these social divisions weren't some divine law or a natural order of human capability. No, they were entirely man-made. The deep-seated biases surrounding certain names were constructed in a very specific historical environment, one that was completely defined by rigid hierarchies and absolute monarchies. The origin of the stigma was at its core essentially a systemic mechanism of political control. Think of it as a 3-step process. Step 1. If a family or an official fell out of favor with the king or the ruling power, political punishment was exacted. Step 2. This punishment wasn't just physical, it was intellectual. The targeted families were deliberately denied access to any education. And then step 3, stripped of the ability to learn and advance, they were forced into the lower class, which was historically referred to as the Songmin. The ruling class literally manufactured this lower class by tying specific surnames to an enforced ignorance and then just never released them from that chain. It was, for all intents and purposes, a generational trap. And this brilliantly illustrates the vast chasm between the past and the present. I mean, the laws of the Joseon Dynasty relied heavily on political punishment, a strict class system, and forced ignorance just to maintain control. But modern South Korea, it operates under an entirely different paradigm. It's a completely new nation with universal rules, focused totally on the future. The source makes the argument that bringing the defunct, oppressive laws of the Joseon era into the modern Republic of Korea makes absolutely zero sense. The modern nation was built to forge new rules for humanity, not to recycle the punishments of ancient kings. So how was that historical chain of forced ignorance actually broken? Because it wasn't just through changing laws on a piece of paper. It happened through a massive dynamic shift in the entire society. Following the absolute devastation of war, South Korea experienced what you could literally call an educational miracle. This was the historical turning point. The very tool that was historically withheld from the lower classes, education, became the exact weapon used to rebuild the entire nation from the ground up. The source really highlights this incredibly powerful ethos that was instilled in the post-war baby boomer generation. I want you to picture this. Kids in a severely impoverished, war-torn country going to these really rudimentary schools and being taught this exact phrase. We were born into this land, charged with the historic mission of regenerating the nation. The source points out just how globally unprecedented this was. In a country that had next to nothing, they were teaching starving children that they had a monumental historical duty to develop their talents, achieve true independence, and eventually contribute to global prosperity. And this wasn't just some empty slogan. It resulted in real rapid action. Schools were being established across the nation at a completely breakneck pace. For the first time in the region's entire history, the focus was completely on universal knowledge. Everyone, regardless of gender, age, or their historical bloodline, was thrust into the educational system. The source emphasizes that taking a completely impoverished nation and building the infrastructure to educate the entire populace so quickly is a feat basically unparalleled in human history. This massive influx of knowledge ended up creating a completely new type of citizen, which brings us to the absolute core thesis of the source material. Because modern Korea successfully transformed into a society of universally educated individuals, the historical lower class, the Sangmen, practically no longer exists. It has been entirely overwritten by an intellectual society. When you flood a society with that much education, the artificial boundaries of the past simply dissolve. Think about it. Historically, the definition of what made someone Sangmin in the first place had absolutely nothing to do with something inherently flawed in their DNA. It was a class defined primarily by a forced lack of education and the ignorance that resulted from that. It was a status maintained by literally being kept in the dark. But if universal education completely eradicates that ignorance, then the very foundation of what defines that class is destroyed entirely. The condition for the stigma? It's just gone. So the crucial point is this question right here. Can an intellectual be a Sangmin? The source poses this as a really interesting logical challenge. If the definition of the lower class is uneducated, then a person who is educated, who actively contributes to society, and who works for the betterment of the nation and humanity, simply cannot belong to that class. It is a total logical contradiction. The source insists that in today's landscape, in a true intellectual society, the ancient concept of the Sangmen is entirely void. Therefore, the time has come to completely move beyond bloodlines. If the societal structure of the Joseon era is gone, and the ignorance that defined the lower class has been totally cured by modern education, then the only thing keeping the stigma alive today is our own psychology. The source passionately argues that modern intellectuals absolutely must dismantle these remaining psychological chains. We have to stop letting the ghosts of defunct laws dictate our self-worth, or how we perceive others. To actually make this a reality, the source outlines some clear actions for the future. First up, completely abandon the jinx or trauma associated with certain names. It's just an outdated concept. Second, and this is a pretty bold proposition from the source, the state should actively support surname changes for those who truly want to shed that historical baggage. Just like people change given names they dislike, they should be empowered to change their surnames to fully sever ties with historical prejudice. And finally, we just have to stop repeating the mistakes of our ancestors. As modern intellectuals, our goal should be to write new, equitable laws and frameworks for the future of humanity, rather than carrying around the petty divisions of the past. The era of boasting about, or on the flip side, hiding from, a bloodline handed down from ancient history is totally over. The question we should be asking is no longer, what legacy did you passively inherit from the Joseon era? The question now is, what kind of legacy will you actively create for the future? It's a huge shift from looking backward in shame or unearned pride to looking forward with real purpose. So take a second and think about what historical narratives you might be holding on to that just no longer serve you. Until next time.